Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and an honour to speak to Bill 12 and here at third reading. And I, along with my Alberta Party colleagues, will proudly be supporting this bill. But I think it's important we understand the context here that got us to this point. And I will say that it is a terrible shame that it has come to this. That in the great Confederation of Canada, we need to be in a position where we pass legislation in this Assembly that could have the impact of hurting our neighbours. And it's unfortunate because the reason that we need to do that is that our neighbours have chosen to take actions that hurt the people of Alberta. And it's a real shame that it got to this point. And when I reflect on how it is that we got to this place and why it is that we find ourselves in this position, I can't help but think what it is that this government could have done sooner to ensure that we were in a better position, to ensure that it didn't come to this. This is a government that's moved forward very aggressively with an environmental platform, with their climate, what they call their climate leadership plan. And I truly think that they believe that by simply having a carbon tax in the province of Alberta, the majority of people of British Columbia, the government of BC would go, you know, good enough. I'll accept that grand bargain. I see that Alberta is taking action on climate change, and so those of us in BC will accept a pipeline. I think that was meant to be this grand bargain, this great trade-off. But of course, here we are. It obviously hasn't worked out that way. The issue of climate change is a defining issue of our time. It's an issue that the people of Alberta and the people of BC, certainly the government of Alberta and the government of BC, both being New Democrat governments, ought to be aligned on. Alberta has taken action to reduce carbon emissions, to stimulate investment and innovation that's going to not only address carbon emissions, water use, land use, environmental impacts of oil and gas production in the province of Alberta. Those technologies are going to be the next generation. It's going to diversify our economy. That's the idea behind what this government has been pushing. What is such a shame is that that aspect has not been shared with the people of British Columbia. The environmental benefits of shipping Alberta crude through British Columbia to world markets has not been aggressively marketed by this government. Certainly not until recently, and I would even argue the environmental case has never really properly been made by this government to the people of British Columbia. Sure, they talk about the economic benefits, and those are real. Those are real to the people of British Columbia. Those are real to Indigenous communities all along the route, both in British Columbia and Alberta. There is real, genuine partnership with Indigenous peoples. Kinder Morgan did a remarkable thing in the work that they did with consultation with Indigenous communities, and good on them. I think they've set a standard for what that consultation can and should look like. Is support unanimous? Of course it's not. I don't think you'll ever get unanimity on really any issue, certainly not an issue as contentious as this one. But I do think the process has been very good in terms of how Indigenous peoples have been consulted. Again, that is not something this government has done much work to really emphasize. Instead of talking up the environmental benefits of this pipeline, instead of talking up Alberta's track record as a responsible producer of oil and gas, as a responsible regulator, in fact, our regulator is world-renowned. Alberta exports its regulatory expertise all around the world. And this is something that we should be shouting from the rooftops, that Alberta should be the shining example that the rest of the world aspires to. Well, the good news is Alberta is the shining example that the rest of the world aspires to. Our regulatory structure is far, far more advanced than the United States even, and certainly compared to the countries whose crude we will be displacing on the market with the Alberta oil sands crude, places like Venezuela, Nigeria, their track records are abysmal. Their human rights records are just abhorrent. Alberta has the most environmentally responsible, the most socially responsible oil and gas industry in the whole world, and that is something we ought to be fiercely proud of in this province. Unfortunately, it's not a story that's been told loudly or longly enough, or often enough, by this government. And as a result, we are in this position where British Columbia is retaliating against Alberta crude, against a pipeline that, by the way, has gone through, I think, probably one of, if not the most extensive regulatory review processes in the history of these sorts of projects. The 157 conditions that were placed on the project, I think, speak to the comprehensive nature of that environmental review. We have gone through a review. The project has been approved by the national regulator, the National Energy Board. It has been approved by the federal government, and it should go ahead. But for political reasons, in terms of saving their own political hide, in terms of the fact that the BC NDP find themselves in a position to be propped up by just 3 lonely Green Party MLAs, we are in a position of having to potentially take action to make sure we maximize return to Albertans from our natural resources. And that's what this bill is all about. And so that is why, while I certainly do not wish that Alberta producers would need to suffer from having this, the powers that are invested in this bill be used, if that's what it comes to, well, that's so be it. That's what has to happen. But if that is what it comes to, I think it's very important that this government think very hard about what compensation industry would receive. Now, I've talked with many, many people in industry, both in my constituency, just walking down the street, and talking formally with advocacy groups, part of the energy industry. And they have said to me, in general terms, we are supportive of Bill 12. We're on board with this. We'd really rather it didn't have to come to this, but here we are. But there is some concern about whether there would be compensation paid should the government of Alberta dictate to whom and when and to where and in which volumes Alberta product is shipped. There's concern about the impact on existing shipper agreements. Would the companies be perhaps, the shippers perhaps be exposed to legal liability? Certainly there's a financial liability, and again, there's an understanding that we're in this thing together as Albertans and as Alberta companies, and if this is what it takes to get a pipeline built in the best interest of our province, well, so be it. That's what it takes. I would have liked to see in this bill, or at least hear more definitively from the Minister of Energy or from the Premier, specifically what the plan would be for compensation. We haven't heard that. I've heard more generalities that perhaps maybe possibly something might happen, but I think would have liked to have seen more specific detail on that. The other piece is when you have a piece of legislation as powerful as this, that this power ought to be limited in some way. And so that's why I was so pleased that the government did in fact accept the Alberta Party amendment brought forward by the member for Calgary-McKay-Nose Hill, and thank you very much to her for stewarding that amendment through the Assembly, that added a sunset clause to this bill. This bill will expire unless further renewed by the Legislative Assembly. And I believe that has given industry some assurance that these dramatic powers will not exist in perpetuity unless there is a legitimate need for them. We are in extreme times, and desperate and extreme times call for desperate measures, and that's what this bill is. And it is good that we have been able to limit the power of government to exercise such powers for a relatively short period of time until hopefully we bridge and get past this point that we find ourselves in, and these powers are no longer needed. But to the degree that they would be, they're there and can be exercised. So we'll certainly be supporting this bill, especially given the acceptance of the government, and thank you again for working collaboratively across the aisle to build in that sunset clause to improve the bill, and look forward to voting for Bill 12 at third reading. Thank you, Madam Speaker.